In the 1980s, the village of Narborough in Leicestershire, England, was rocked by the horrific slayings of two teenage girls, one in 1983, the other in 1986. For years, the residents of the small village community eyed one another with suspicion, wondering who among them was capable of such atrocities. It wasn't until 1987 that answers came. Pioneering DNA technology led investigators to 27-year-old Colin Pitchfork, a married man with two young sons and a small criminal record. It seemed that Pitchfork's crimes had quickly escalated. What started as indecent exposure had soon become assault and murder. A seemingly hard-working bakery employee, Pitchfork had another side to him. He was described later by a psychiatrist as possessing a psychopathic personality disorder. Join us for this documentary as we examine the groundbreaking case of Colin Pitchfork, the first man convicted of murder using DNA. The murder of Lynda Mann. At around 7:20 in the morning of November 22nd, 1983, a hospital employee heading to the Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital in the village of Narborough took a shortcut through a footpath known as the Black Pad. As he passed by, something odd caught his eye. At first, he assumed it was a partially clothed mannequin, but when he stopped to look properly, he realised that what he was looking at was not a mannequin at all, but a corpse. The worker ran out onto the nearest road and flagged down a passing vehicle, which happened to be driven by an ambulance driver. Returning to the path, the ambulance driver spotted the body and immediately dashed towards it. A young girl, a teenager, was lying on the ground, her legs extended and her head turned to one side. There was blood around her nose, a bruise to her chin. Her underwear, jeans and shoes were in a rolled up heap a short distance away. Her scarf was wrapped around her neck, crossed at the back. The ambulance driver checked her pulse, but there was none. Just over an hour after the body was discovered, at around 8:30 a.m, police arrived on the scene, along with a pathologist. Detectives and around 30 police officers searched the remainder of the area, including the woods, fields, the path, and a nearby building site for clues as to who had committed this horrific crime. Scent dogs were brought in to assist with the search too. Meanwhile, the pathologist noted that signs of rigor mortis were present and that the girl had likely died the evening prior. They also observed the blood around the girl's nostrils and various scratch marks on her face. Investigators had initially believed that her legs had been covered with a coating of brick-coloured leg makeup, but the pathologist informed them that the colour of the girl's legs was simply a result of the cold weather. The likely motivation behind the murder was sexual. The killer had left bodily fluids behind. Edward Eddie Eastwood went to work that morning with a pit in his stomach. His 15-year-old stepdaughter, Lynda Mann, had been missing since last night. She hadn't come home from her friend's house, and when he and Lynda's mother attempted to go to the police, they were brushed off. Lynda was a teenager. She was probably just messing around and asserting her independence. But while Lynda's mother, Kathleen "Kath" Mann, agreed with the notion that her daughter was independent, it was not like Lynda not to come home. She was punctual, always back between 9:45 and 10 o'clock at night. She was never late, and if she was, she did her best to inform her family. When Eddie turned up to work and mentioned Lynda's disappearance, he was soon informed that a young girl's body had been found along the black pad. Alarmed, Eddie immediately drove to the scene. He attempted to push through the police barricade, but was stopped by uniformed officers. He told them, "That's my daughter. I think that's my daughter, Lynda." An officer began taking notes, but Eddie was eventually told, "Go home. We'll call on you." Lynda Mann was described as happy-go-lucky and independent by those who knew her. On the day of her disappearance, she had returned home from school and immediately headed out again to begin her first babysitting gig of the night at 5 p.m. By all accounts, Lynda loved earning her own money, and she was good with children. It was a no-brainer that she'd become a popular babysitter in her community. Like any typical 15-year-old, she loved experimenting with her style and had recently become interested in hair dye, makeup, and clothes. If she couldn't afford to add anything new to her wardrobe, she picked up extra work to earn money and made her own clothes. She was a good student and popular, and dreamt of one day travelling the world. She practiced French, German, and Italian, and wanted to eventually attempt learning Chinese. Lynda's first babysitting job of the night ended at 6:20 p.m. She then returned home, had dinner with Eddie, and headed off again at 6:45 p.m. for another job. This time though, her neighbour informed her that she wasn't needed. Disappointed that she wouldn't get paid, but not entirely disheartened, Lynda decided to go and see her friends. She stopped in briefly to see her best friend at around 7:30 p.m, then headed out again to see another girl, Caroline, whom Lynda had let borrow a record. Caroline later recalled, "I knew it was about 7:30 because Lynda was in and out of the door before the music for Coronation Street came on the telly." After leaving Caroline's, Lynda walked up Forest Road and took a path that later joined the Black Pad. Eddie and Kath went out that evening too. When they returned home, Lynda's older sister told them that she hadn't come home. The two parents subsequently went out looking for the 15-year-old. They knocked on neighbours' doors, drove around the village streets, and stopped by popular teen hangouts. But they found nothing. When they reported Lynda's disappearance to the police, they were told that she'd probably come home soon. The investigation. Eddie Eastwood was soon brought back to the Black Pad, where he formally identified Lynda's body. Though her face was injured, he immediately recognised her new jacket, which she was still paying off at the time of her death. She wore it everywhere and loved it dearly. Eddie later took the lead when speaking with reporters. Accounts of Kath's behaviour at the time note that she was numb, unable to speak or even cry. Eddie, as the family stood outside of their home in Narborough, told the media, "I feel like I've been hit over the skull with a brick. It just will not sink in." Lynda was such a happy, polite girl, a little old-fashioned, but very popular at school and conscientious about her schoolwork. It's unbelievable that anyone could do this to her. My wife and I are devastated. A post-mortem was carried out at 2 p.m. the day after Lynda's body was recovered. She'd suffered injuries, bruises and scratches, mostly, to her right cheek and eye, chin, the front of her neck, and her collarbone. Detectives theorised that she'd been hit in the face, possibly on the chin, and knocked unconscious. The pathologist determined that she'd likely been struck in the chest, which had led to the heavy bruising on her collarbone. Though investigators thought it was also possible Lynda's attacker had kneeled on her while strangling her to death. Dirt marks on the back of the 15-year-old's heels indicated that she'd been dragged by her attacker at some point during the night. The post-mortem also bolstered the police theory that the motivation had been sexual, with the pathologist concluding in their report, sexual intercourse was attempted and premature ejaculation occurred. One of the biggest pieces of evidence in the early investigation into Lynda's demise was the semen swab taken from her body, which revealed that the killer had a very specific blood group. So specific, in fact, that only 1 out of 10 male adults in England belonged to this particular group. While this blood test could not possibly identify the perpetrator, it was at least a starting point. Investigators soon turned their attention to Eddie, Lynda's grief-stricken stepfather. While he would later state his belief that he'd been singled out by an ex-boyfriend of Lynda's, police made it clear that their examination of Eddie as a suspect was very much part of a standard police procedure. Eddie was close to the family, but a stepfather, not a biological father, and he had only been married to Kath for a short period of time. Before long though, the theory that Eddie was responsible for the assault and murder of his stepdaughter fell through. Not only did his blood type not match up with the killer's, but he had an alibi. On the night of the crime, Eddie was in the company of a police officer at the pub. Now that Eddie was out of the frame for murder, authorities began compiling lists of sex offenders, not just in the local area, but in Leicestershire and the Midlands. As well as rapists, the lists were made up of those who'd carried out other assaults and those who'd committed indecent exposure. The suspects also consisted solely of individuals between the ages of 13 and 34 due to the high sperm count found in the semen sample collected from the body. All of the people on the list who were in prison or dead at the time of Lynda's demise were removed. This painstaking process at the time had all been done by hand. Law enforcement spent hundreds of hours putting together the lists before entering them into a newfangled computer database. They hoped that a name collected during their house-to-house inquiries would also come up on one of their lists. A separate squad was soon formed to cover the Carlton Hayes Hospital, because numerous sex offenders and substance abusers had been treated with the facility, and investigators suspected that since the hospital was so close to the scene of the murder, there may be some sort of link between the two. The hospital, understandably, resented the brush their patients were being tarred with. They refused to hand over background information about their patients and assured investigators, "Our wards are secure." Authorities persisted though, with teams looking at 10,000 hospital patients who were believed to be potential suspects. Various young men were investigated over the coming weeks. One had a dyed punk hairdo, like a pot of geraniums cropped off flat. Another was a dark-haired teen seen running on Kipling Drive on the night of the crime. Police determined he wasn't a jogger because he'd been seen in ordinary clothing. The day after the body was found, 2 teen boys purchased a newspaper and intently studied the article about Lynda's death. This put them on the map too. By Christmas, Superintendent David Baker had announced that Lynda likely knew her killer, telling the media there were probably acquaintances, and perhaps what started off as a kiss and a cuddle developed into something that got out of hand, resulting in Lynda's death. But only the person responsible can tell us what actually happened. This was the first time investigators had publicly revealed this theory. Around this same time, Kath told reporters of her frustration that no real progress had been made. She stated, "This man has got to be punished, and I hope anyone who knows him will think twice about harbouring him. We just do not have an existence anymore, and he is to blame." Unfortunately for Kath, Eddie, and Lynda's 2 sisters, answers would not come for some years yet. By April, the murder squad had wound down to just 8 police officers, and by the time Easter rolled around, it was effectively over. By the summer, only 2 men remained working from the Lynda Mann incident room. They took calls about possible sightings of the punk-haired teen and about suspicious husbands and brothers-in-law. But nothing came of these leads. About 150 blood tests had been administered to potential suspects during the course of the investigation, but none had matched their killer. In October of 1985, a 16-year-old trainee hairdresser said goodnight to her boyfriend and began the walk home. A resident of Wigston, a few miles east of Narborough, she made the journey down an unlit footpath heading towards Kenilworth Road, where she was approached by a shadowy figure. A man was pacing back and forth. His quick movements unsettled her. He was dressed in a dark hooded jacket, and the 16-year-old hoped that she could just move quickly past him. But as she walked, he reached out and hooked an arm around her leg. A moment later, she felt the cold metal of a screwdriver pressed against her neck. The man told her, "Shut up, or I'll kill you." He then dragged the teenager along the pavement, between the houses, and into a row of garages where he pushed her against a brick wall. Despite her pleas, the man wouldn't let her go. He pushed the young girl to the ground, unzipped his trousers, and forced himself inside her mouth. A moment later, he withdrew and began to masturbate. He then did the same thing a second time. The man behind the crime, later identified as Pitchfork, would later recall, "I told her she was stupid to be walking home alone at that time of night." He added that he told the girl to never walk the streets at night. "You might not be enjoying this, but I ain't hurting you. I could have knocked you off dead easy." He also told her that he was simply teaching her a lesson about the dangers of walking home at night. Before he left, the man told the 16-year-old, "Don't say anything to anybody, or I'll come back and find you." Though she never told her parents about what happened, the girl confided in a fellow hairdresser and the manager of the salon she worked at. The manager subsequently called the police. On the morning of July the 31st, 1986, 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth was awoken by her father, Robin. Dawn had recently taken a part-time job at a newsagent, and she was going to be late if she slept in any longer. Described as an artistic girl with a talent for drawing, Dawn was a reliable, likeable girl, and her parents noted that, like Lynda, she was always home on time, at 9:30 p.m. sharp. The day of July the 31st, though, was different. She attended work as normal, then received her pay, and finished for the day at around 3:30 p.m. It was just a few minutes walk home, so Dawn headed back and told her mother, Barbara, she was heading out to see her friends. Barbara told her to be home by 7 because she and Robin were going to a birthday party for a friend's child that evening. Dawn never returned home that night. Barbara headed to the party to drop off presents alone and returned at 7:30. She then set out to see her daughter's friend, Sue, whom she was supposed to be visiting that afternoon. But Sue hadn't been in when she'd visited, and her mother reported that she hadn't seen Dawn since 4:30 p.m. Barbara combed through the village streets for her daughter before finding Dawn's friend, Sue and Sharon, in Narborough. They had no idea where the 15-year-old could be, but helped Robin and Barbara look for her. Several other friends assisted in the search, but no trace of the teenager was found. Her parents were well aware of the Lynda Mann case and were terrified that Dawn had become another victim of Lynda's killer, who was still at large. However, they likely waited until 9:40 p.m. before contacting the police. They believed that the authorities would likely tell them to wait until she was normally home before filing a missing persons report. Even though Lynda's killer was never apprehended, investigators seemed to repeat their mistakes by not immediately taking Dawn's case seriously. They asked her parents repeatedly if they were sure she hadn't run away from home or lost track of time. Barbara told them, "No, she's not run off. When she was 5 minutes late, I knew something was wrong." Robin added that his daughter never hesitated to call him when she needed a lift. The Ashworth family home was searched. Robin was interrogated much in the same that Eddie Eastwood had been. A group of tracking dogs were brought in, but they weren't given any of Dawn's clothes. They were reportedly only used to notice any disturbed undergrowth. Then, on August the 2nd, just a few days after Dawn went missing, her blue denim jacket was found in a field between the M1 motorway and a footpath known as 10 Pound Lane. The footpath was just off the black pad. Shortly afterwards, Dawn's body was found beneath a heap of foliage. At first, only the fingerprints of one hand were visible. Like Lynda, Dawn was found nude from the waist down. Her shoes were still on though, and her underwear was still around her ankles. One earring was missing and blood was smeared across her left thigh. Dawn's body was in rigor mortis and insects had disturbed her remains, depositing eggs and biting her skin. Several of her wounds were found to be related to bugs rather than her assault and murder. Her body was later formally identified by her father. The post-mortem showed that Dawn had been viciously beaten. She had injuries to the left of her forehead, to her nose, a swollen left cheek, bruising to the left eye, and several more bruises to her jawline and ears. Her lips were swollen, and her braces had cut the inside of her mouth. Her chest and collarbones also showed signs of injury. Her cause of death was ruled as manual strangulation. Her killer possibly held her in a chokehold, his forearm pressed against her larynx as he held her from behind. That said, the pathologist could not fully rule out the use of a ligature. Like Lynda, her attack had been sexually motivated. Semen samples were taken from Dawn's body, along with various other forensic evidence, such as fingernail clippings, hair samples, and a red fibre which was discovered in the mound of foliage covering her body. The first tangible suspect in Dawn's case was a 17-year-old named Richard Buckland. Described as a motorcycle enthusiast with learning difficulties, Buckland worked as a kitchen porter at Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital. A red motorcycle, resembling one he owned, was seen by numerous different witnesses in various locations, including parked beneath the motorway bridge around noon on the day of the murder. Another witness saw it there at around 4:45 p.m, while another saw a red motorbike helmet near 10 Pound Lane at 5:15 p.m. Buckland had been briefly questioned by police earlier when he'd volunteered information on the day after Dawn's body was found. He claimed to have seen her that night, out walking. However, police did not question him further until a colleague of Buckland's came forward and claimed that on August the 1st, one day before the body was recovered, Buckland had told him that her body had been found in a hedge near a gate by the M1 bridge. When asked how he knew this, he replied, "Someone told me. Her body was hanging from a tree." Detectives from the murder squad approached Buckland on August the 8th at his parents' house and subsequently arrested him. In his interview, he told investigators that he knew Dawn and had spoken to her before, but that was about it. Before long though, with investigators probing him, he began talking about a girl he'd met when he was 14. The pair engaged in sex numerous times, and on at least one occasion, he'd hit her. His younger brother had told him he didn't know his own strengths. He complained that girls didn't like him, adding, "I call them slags a lot. Anything that comes into my head. Slags, dogs, whores, bitches." Buckland then informed authorities that he'd liked girls younger than him, and even mentioned issues he'd had with premature ejaculation, something investigators noted he had in common with the killer. He eventually claimed, under pressure from police, that he'd seen Dawn walking up the lane, and he'd also seen a man carrying a stick. It wasn't enough for detectives though, who suggested he was responsible and had killed the 15-year-old by accident, in a fit of rage. Buckland replied, "I can't remember. I probably went really mad, and I don't know it." Buckland then told detectives what they wanted to hear, that he'd groped Dawn, held her down, and that he became confused and his head began spinning until he was fleeing the scene. He added that there was no man with a stick. Over the next few hours though, Buckland would go on to give and retract confusing statements, claiming he'd never had sex even though he'd admitted earlier that he had engaged in intercourse with another woman who wasn't Dawn. Though he reportedly asked for a blood test, this didn't come immediately. Investigators continued to question the 17-year-old for hours on end, and he continued to give confusing, conflicting statements. Buckland eventually revealed that he had abused a 9-year-old girl, though he described her as being 11. Police investigated and verified this incident. They also spoke with his ex-girlfriend, who described their relationship as being horrifically violent. On August the 9th, the police announced that Buckland had been arrested and charged for Dawn's murder. He refused to confess to killing Lynda, but police believed he was responsible and simply lying about his involvement. Eventually though, Buckland's blood was tested. Though he was found to not have the unique blood type of the killer, investigators argued that no one could be positively excluded. It wasn't until Buckland's father brought it up with his son's lawyer that the police began to look into DNA testing, which was at that point a new and exciting up-and-coming technology. Located at the University of Leicester, 5 miles northwest of Narborough, was geneticist Alec Jeffreys, who was working on DNA profiling, a new forensic technique he had accidentally come across while studying how inherited illnesses pass between family members. During his failed experiment, The Guardian reported he had extracted DNA from cells and attached it to photographic film, which was then left in a photographic developing tank. Once extracted, the film showed a sequence of bars. Jeffreys quickly realized that every individual whose cells had been used in the experiment could be identified with great precision. The accidental discovery had been made in 1984, but its usefulness in criminal cases was not yet known. It wasn't until Jeffreys was approached by police in 1986 that excitement over this discovery began to brew. Investigators asked if he could determine if Buckland was responsible for the murders of Lynda and Dawn using DNA profiling. Jeffreys agreed, and before long, investigators had their answer. One man was responsible for the rapes and murders of Dawn and Lynda, but that one man was not Richard Buckland. The police were in such disbelief that they had Jeffreys run his tests a second and third time. Still, the answers remained the same, and Buckland was released after 3 months in custody. But it was back to the drawing board for detectives, who felt that if this shiny new technology was going to help free the innocent, then it should also help identify the guilty. They began sending out letters to every man born between 1953 and 1970, undertaking a huge operation which would see the DNA taken from every man in this age range who had lived or worked in the Narborough area in the last few years. 2 testing centres were set up, with investigators offering morning and evening sessions to help men fit the test around their work schedule. Very few men declined to participate in the procedure, with those who did claiming they didn't like needles or the police. Some of these men would later change their minds, however, possibly due to the pressure from the local community who wanted to see a stop to the heinous crimes carried out by the killer of Dawn Ashworth and Lynda Mann. The scale of the operation and the newness of the technology being used to carry it out soon made headlines across the globe, with the LA Times reporting police investigating the murders of 2 teenage girls near this small Midlands village are applying a new scientific technique. Some predict it could be the most significant breakthrough in resolving serious crime since fingerprinting was invented. Despite the size of the operation undertaken, police ended up no closer to answers 8 months later, having tested over 5,500 men. It wasn't until September of 1987 that they found out why their plan hadn't worked. A woman came forward and claimed that she'd overheard one of her colleagues, Ian Kelly, admitting to taking the blood test for one of their other colleagues, a married father of 2 named Colin Pitchfork. Kelly had impersonated Pitchfork because he had already had a conviction for indecent exposure and claimed he didn't want the hassle of dealing with the police. Kelly was arrested at first, with Pitchfork close behind him. In the back of a police vehicle, he told investigators, "I must let a few people know what's happened to me before they read it in the papers. Then I'll tell you everything. But I want to do it my own way, because it's really a story of my life, not just the story of a month or 2. Colin Pitchfork was born on March 23, 1960, in the village of Newbold Verdon in Leicestershire. The second of 3 children, he later told his wife Carol that he was the black sheep of his family. His older sister was determined to become a doctor in 1979 when Pitchfork and Carol met, while his younger brother dreamed of studying engineering at university. He later recalled that as a young boy, he enjoyed flashing to the girls, stating, "Right there at my own house from the age of 11. I used to like to show it. I started going out on the streets to do it. I started showing it to strange girls." As a child, Pitchfork was a member of the Scouts, as his mother was deeply involved with the organisation. However, he was often made fun of by the other boys, especially when they had to use the communal showers. He also recalled disliking most of the subjects in school, but noted English was his favourite. He stated that while his mother was a religious and spiritual woman, he did not enjoy going to church, finding it hypocritical. He also felt largely overshadowed by his successful and academically talented older sister. As a teenager, he was caught flashing numerous times. On the second time, he was charged in court and subsequently kicked out of the Scouts. After meeting Carol in 1979, they got engaged and began living as husband and wife. Carol recalled that despite his promises, Pitchfork was caught flashing again. He was 21 at the time, but the probation service told him he'd outgrown his problem. According to Carol, they then put him on probation once more. Carol and Pitchfork tied the knot in 1981, and Pitchfork remained employed at Hampshire's bakery. He had an artistic streak and began owning his talent for cake decoration. His supervisor later reported that though he was a good worker and timekeeper, he was also moody and couldn't leave women employees alone. He was always chatting them up. He was eventually caught flashing yet again and sent for psychiatric counselling at Carlton Hayes Hospital. Things didn't improve over the next few years. By 1983, Carol was pregnant with the couple's first child, and Pitchfork had taken a cake decorating class at Southfields College. It was here that he met an 18-year-old student named Leslie, whom he eventually began an affair with. It didn't go unnoticed. Carol had her suspicions for some time before he eventually admitted it. He later told investigators that he stopped flashing when he was having an affair with Leslie because he was excited by their secret relationship and excited about the prospect of his wife catching him in the act. Carol, though, was heartbroken when he confessed to the affair. When recounting the argument they had following the admittance, Carol stated, "He said she gave him something I couldn't give him because she was so young." When she asked if she, at 23, was too old for him, he told her it was because Leslie was a virgin and Carol was not. This was not Pitchfork's final affair. He would later go on to have another in 1986 with a divorced mother of one. The woman eventually became pregnant by him, and though she planned to abort the child, she changed her mind at the last minute. She delivered the baby in January 1987, but sadly, it was stillborn. Following the affair with Leslie, Carol reconciled with Pitchfork, who claimed that their baby would need two parents to raise it. Shortly afterwards, they decided to move to Narborough for a fresh start. Pitchfork had briefly appeared on police's radar back in 1984, following the demise of Lynda Mann. On January the 22nd, a PC who was conducting door-to-door inquiries turned up on the doorstep of a semi-detached house on Hayburn Close. The owner was a 25-year-old Colin Pitchfork, who'd recently moved into the building with his wife and a young baby. When Carol answered the door, she called for her husband, but it took him a few minutes to appear. He later told police, "I had to compose myself. Initially, Pitchfork wondered if he was being nabbed for stealing floorboards from a construction site. He'd also taken a unit he thought would fit well in the kitchen. However, the police were oblivious to his part in the theft. Shortly after basic door-to-door inquiries were carried out, investigators found that Pitchfork was the name of one of the men on their lists of possible suspects, as he'd been convicted several times for flashing. However, when questioned, Pitchfork was able to provide a partial alibi. He'd driven his wife to her night class at the college she was attending, their baby asleep in the back of the car. He then returned home and sat with the baby until it was time for Carol to be picked up again. Though he didn't have an actual alibi for between 6:45 and 9:15 that night, investigators surmised that he wouldn't leave the baby alone to go and commit his crimes, and it did not occur to them that he might take the baby with him. Now in custody for the murders of Dawn and Lynda, Pitchfork gave investigators his life story. By the time he got to his 14th year on Earth, detectives tried to shift his focus to the murders, but he became agitated by this and insisted that he be allowed to control the situation. During his interview, Pitchfork explained that he'd had the baby with him at the time of Lynda's murder. His son had been asleep in the carry cart in the back of his vehicle. He recalled he had been looking for a girl to flash when he had seen Lynda and waited for her beneath the streetlight. She ran away in shock and horror when he flashed her, and he followed after her. Pitchfork said Lynda froze when she reached the unlit footpath, and that he grabbed her, took her off the path, and had a conversation with her. He claimed that Lynda backed herself into a corner, and that she got herself into the situation by not screaming, which would have scared him off and caused him to flee. Pitchfork told investigators that Lynda had been terrified, but she decided to just let me do it, most likely in the vain hope that he would let her go afterwards. But he didn't. Pitchfork said he killed Lynda because he was afraid that she would recognize him. He had a wedding ring on, and she repeatedly asked him about his wife, so she knew he was married. Not only that, but he had on a single earring and was balding. Pitchfork knew he was coming to live in the village soon, and he couldn't take the risk that Lynda might report him. When relaying the details of his encounter with and subsequent murder of Dawn Ashworth, investigators noted that they sounded much the same as Lynda's case. Pitchfork was meant to be out purchasing food colouring, but he spotted Dawn stepping onto the footpath, and he pulled his motorbike over and followed her inside. She didn't react to his flashing and continued to walk, and he later claimed that, like Lynda, she had backed herself into a corner. He also said again that he killed Dawn because he was worried she could identify him. He had his motorcycle jacket on and his riding ring. Though she pleaded for him not to attack her, Dawn, like Lynda, hoped that by putting up less of a fuss and keeping calm, she might survive the assault. When asked why he killed Dawn, he replied, "Opportunity. She was there and I was there." Colin Pitchfork told investigators that he'd flashed over 1,000 women and girls during his lifetime. He also admitted to several other unsolved rapes and less violent assaults, including that of the 16-year-old hairdressing trainee. Investigators noted that he tended to omit details. Pitchfork never admitted that he'd threatened the 16-year-old with a screwdriver, and he denied masturbating in front of the women and girls he'd flashed. He reportedly never mentioned premature ejaculation and denied that this was any sort of problem he dealt with. By all accounts, Pitchfork wanted to be in control. He wanted the police to know his entire story, his way, and he wanted the women and girls he targeted to do exactly as he said. In January of 1988, Pitchfork appeared in court. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of rape, 2 counts of indecent assault, and 1 count of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. A psychiatric report concluded that Pitchfork had a personality disorder of a psychopathic type accompanied by serious psychosexual pathology. It further warned that he will obviously continue to be an extremely dangerous individual while the psychopathology continues. Pitchfork was sentenced to life in prison, which at the time was a minimum of 30 years, though his number was reduced to 28 in 2009 following an appeal. In 2016, the Parole Board for England and Wales heard Pitchfork's case for early release on parole. Though his application was declined, it was recommended that he be moved to an open prison due to his supposed improved behaviour in prison. During his time behind bars, Pitchfork had earned a degree and had started transcribing printed music into Braille. He had also become something of an artist, creating a sculpture in 2009 that was exhibited at the Royal Festival Hall. Pitchfork was moved to an open prison as recommended. In 2018, the parole board rejected his appeal for release once more. In 2021, his appeal was finally granted. He was released on parole on September 1st, 2021. However, 2 months later, he was recalled to prison for breaching his parole conditions as he had been seen approaching young women while on walks. Police detectives who helped apprehend Pitchfork believe he will never be safe to release due to his psychopathic type personality disorder. In 2023, it was announced that Pitchfork would be released again. However, due to public outcry, the parole board were ordered to reconsider their decision, and his parole was ultimately declined. Though in February 2024, another parole hearing was scheduled. Barbara Ashworth, Dawn's mother, has been less than impressed by Pitchfork's repeated parole attempts, stating, "Words fail me now. He seems to want to fight no matter what. He killed 2 schoolgirls. I know what I'd do. I'd throw away the key." At the time of writing, Colin Pitchfork is still in prison. He is 63 years old.